Right, and we're joined now by Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you. I was going to ask you about the historical context in which this argument is being made about the boundaries, but I think Rapelang's report was quite expansive on that. So perhaps let's talk about one of the issues that was raised there, the regional understanding of these boundaries. What has been understood in terms of Lesotho's claim for land in South Africa?
Yeah, thank you, Tsepo. I think it's historically what most of us are probably aware that it goes back to the Basotho Boer Wars between 1858 and 1868, which were called Imfecane or Kasisotho Difakane, which basically means a crushing and a scattering. And I think as the MP rightfully says, there were very painful negotiations that Morena Moshoeshoe the first made in order to protect the small buffer state, which is now known as Lesotho, and going up to Tababusiu. And then, of course, this was also to do with the incursion of the Afrikaners. So I think for many Basotho-speaking people, that what is the idea, the construct of Lesotho today is a site of great national pride and a sign of great resistance. Now, if we fast forward, over the 1900s, that the second phase of that is the huge dependency, of course, mutual dependency of South Africa on labor within the region, especially on South African miners, and the huge contribution that in fact Basotho labor made to the settler colonial economy, the mining economy of what is now called South Africa, right? And then thirdly, when we move forward from there, that this also then speaks to how we view regionalism and regional integration within the context of Southern Africa as a whole, but within the special and really the particularities of the Lesotho scenario. If we understand that what was taken from the Basotho, what Morena Moshoeshoe negotiated was that, in return for this small enclave that is today the modern Basotho state, was actually the giving away or surrendering about 130 square kilometers of land of what is currently known as the Free State, which is 4 times the size, the geographic size of Lesotho. And lastly, to say that, of course, we understand that as a result of this, there's a huge glut of Basotho both within Lesotho and within South Africa, and that of course there are more Basotho in South Africa than there are in Lesotho. So in many respects, identities and situations of belonging and citizenship are very porous and very complex. And I think that there's a case to be made for the stance that was made by that at the time, the Organization of African Unity, that they were not going to renegotiate colonial wars because of the chaos that might ensue. But I do think that it's important that as South Africa needs to rethink the slightly dismissive posture that it has had towards Lesotho for these and many other geohistorical and geopolitical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Can we take any lead from in existing SADC regional instruments in how to interpret this going forward? And as you were talking, thinking about that, in the greater scheme of things, if we're talking about a borderless Africa, in the evolution of the OAU to the AU, was this ever discussed, or even at CODESA?
Yeah, so I mean, there are several regional integration arrangements that have already been discussed, that have been drafted within the SADC and what was formerly the the SADC with the 1C and the SADC with the 2 Cs, by the way. And this was around the treaty focuses on harmonization of political and socioeconomic policies of member states, encouragement of cultural ties across the region. I think that Lesotho and South Africa would fall squarely within that. The development of human resources and the harmonization of international relations within those member states. Another piece of this is, of course, the obstacles to the free movement of labor and goods amongst and between member states, and most significantly, the free movement of people. Now, this has been thought that we can interpret this, for example, to then suggest that there has to be visa-free movement within, or passport. I think in the case of countries like Lesotho, like Swaziland, like Botswana, for example, which have a very particular and a very porous and symbiotic relationship with what is the modern South African state, which was basically a settler colony, that there's the scope to create something like a Schengen visa, similar to the European Union, where you would be able to move much more freely within these regions, given a very particular geopolitical history, which means then that the SADC could potentially provide this kind of instrument and this kind of architecture for that kind of movement.
So just in terms of the broader regional, or rather Pan-African regional agenda, what will be the impact of this?
So, this also speaks to other colonial dilemmas. I mean, the dilemmas of the Western Sahara. There's this dilemma of the Somaliland region, which is still one of the more, which are the two so far unresolved, settler colonial questions on the African continent. But I think that it also means that we need to rethink and reimagine, Tsepiso and the viewers, the notion of decolonization. Because my reading of this is that essentially what the South African state is doing, what will potentially, the messaging that we are sending out, is that the African Union, or the Organization of African Union, is so static that it can't move and be responsive to policy prescripts, to public opinion, and to public perceptions, and especially to the sentiments that are on the ground. I don't think that it is particularly, I don't think that it is the role of policy instruments that were drafted in the late 1950s, which stated at the time that to redraw colonial borders would be it would result in ensuing chaos. I don't think that we can really we can think that now 60 or 65 years later that our world is so static, that the context is so static, and that our geopolitical and regional relations are so static. I don't think that it could have been anticipated at the time that the context right now would be one of such contestation. Everything was highly speculative. So I do think that the African Union, as well as an instrument, needs to also rethink the question of what self-determination actually means. In the context of the colonial question, we need to rethink, and I think it needs to rethink what decolonization means, especially if some of the colonial borders or the relationships continue to uphold really unjust, completely inequitable colonial conquest. So what really this seems to be speaking to is that a post 1994 African government seems to be supporting the notion of Afrikaner colonial conquest on other African people, on other subjugated people, and elongating that subjugation through jurisdictional power.
All right, thank you so much for speaking to us, political economist and senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko.